Multiculturalism.
For multiculturalism, your essential collocations are embrace multiculturalism or foster multiculturalism. For CELPIP, this is an absolute non-negotiable for reading Part 4 viewpoints. In the real world, remember, Canada operates as a cultural mosaic, not a melting pot. But what's the major pitfall? It's using the preposition to instead of. It is always the benefits of multiculturalism. Moving right along to social cohesion, you're going to want to pair this with promote social cohesion. This maps directly to Speaking Task 7 when you're defending community policies. Culturally, it perfectly reflects Canada's deep emphasis on collective harmony. Just watch out for the trap of confusing cohesion with coercion. They mean wildly different things. When you're talking about a demographic shift, use the phrase undergo a demographic shift. That's your golden ticket for listening Part 6 discussions on aging populations. Think of the aging baby boomer generation and how they impact public policy here. The trap? Missing the article. It's always a demographic shift. Finally, marginalization. Pair it with combat marginalization. It maps beautifully to Writing Task 2 surveys on social equality. In Canada, this often connects to Indigenous reconciliation or immigrant integration. The spelling trap, you've got the single L and a Z versus an S depending on your chosen spelling standard. Just pick one and stay strictly consistent.
These next 4 terms are absolute drivers for high-scoring arguments in Writing Task 2. First up, egalitarian society. You should really aim for the collocation strive for an egalitarian society. Contextually, Canada prides itself on being an egalitarian society through things like universal healthcare and equal opportunity. The biggest trap here? Mispronouncing it in the speaking test. Make sure you say egalitarian. Next, public infrastructure. The absolute strongest collocation here is invest in public infrastructure, and it maps perfectly to the Task 2 survey on town planning. Public transit and community centers are massive Canadian talking points, so there's your context. The trap? Well, infrastructure is uncountable. Never, ever say infrastructures. Then we have civic engagement. Encourage civic engagement, especially for Speaking Task 7 community issues. Volunteering is a huge part of the Canadian ethos, but a common trap is accidentally using the verb engage when you actually need the noun engagement for the full concept. Finally, allocation of resources. Pair this with equitable allocation of resources for those Writing Task 2 budget surveys. You're definitely going to hear this in provincial versus federal funding debates. Just avoid messing up the preposition. It's allocation of, not allocation for. Now we're looking at a pretty distinct societal contrast. On the economic side, income disparity. You'll want to use widen the income disparity or bridge the income disparity. This maps straight to listening Part 6 audio that focuses on socioeconomic issues. The Canadian context often centers right on housing costs in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, which are really driving this disparity. The pitfall? Settling for a simple word like difference instead of disparity. Using disparity is exactly what locks in that higher vocabulary band. On the flip side, we have the systemic safety net, the welfare state. Collocate this with maintain a welfare state, highly useful for reading Part 4 sociopolitical texts. Canada's social safety nets, like employment insurance and universal healthcare, define it as a welfare state, especially compared to its southern neighbor. The trap to avoid here is thinking welfare always has a negative connotation. In Canadian academic context, welfare state is just a purely neutral descriptive term. Continuing with societal structures, let's look at disadvantaged groups. Pair this with support disadvantaged groups for Writing Task 2. It's a critical phrase when you're discussing local government support programs. The main trap is relying on the outdated term the poor instead of this high-scoring phrase. Next, philanthropic initiatives. You can spearhead philanthropic initiatives, which pops up frequently in reading Part 3. Think about the corporate donations and charity drives that are so common during Canadian winters. The only trap here? The exact spelling of PHILANTHROPIC. Then we have eradicate poverty. Pair this with aim to eradicate poverty, especially for Speaking Task 7 when you're discussing federal political platforms. The trap is that eradicate is an absolute verb. That means you should never say partially eradicate. It's literally all or nothing. Finally, fostering inclusivity. Use the phrase committed to fostering inclusivity, which maps so well to Speaking Task 6 workplace integration. It perfectly reflects modern Canadian corporate HR policies. Just be careful not to confuse inclusivity with inclusion. Both work, sure, but inclusivity really highlights an ongoing cultural effort. If you want to ace Speaking Task 7, precise verb-noun pairings are absolutely crucial for these next 3 terms. Take grassroots movement. You can spark a grassroots movement in Speaking Task 7 when talking about local neighborhood pushback against developers. The trap? Grassroots is one single word, and here it typically functions as an adjective. Next up is bureaucratic inefficiency.
You might hinder progress through bureaucratic inefficiency in writing task 2, particularly when you're writing complaints about government processing times. The trap? The spelling of B-U-R-E-A-U-C-R-A-T-I-C. Memorize it carefully, guys. Lastly, mitigate social issues. You'll want to implement policies to mitigate social issues, a phrase that maps nicely to reading part 4. The context often involves harm reduction strategies in Canadian urban centers. A really frequent trap is confusing mitigate with litigate. Remember, mitigate simply means to lessen the severity. To wrap up our society vocabulary, let's look at cultural assimilation. The common collocation is resist cultural assimilation, which you'll often see in reading part 4. Contextually, this is the exact opposite of Canada's multicultural mosaic. Honestly, using assimilation favorably can actually be a cultural faux pas here. Watch out for the double S in assimilation when spelling it out. Next is a paradigm shift. You can say something will represent a paradigm shift in speaking task 7, like the massive transition to remote work or green energy. The trap is the silent G in paradigm. Make sure you do not pronounce it. Finally, implement legislation. Use successfully implement legislation for listening part 6 contexts, like passing new provincial laws. The biggest trap here is that legislation is an uncountable noun. You should never, ever say legislations.
Economy and the workplace, corporate norms and financial policy.
A truly crucial skill is mapping these economic terms to formal workplace scenarios. Let's start with remuneration. You'll often see competitive remuneration package mapped to a task 1 formal letter, specifically when negotiating a job offer. This is the standard Canadian HR term for salary and benefits combined. The trap? Spelling it re-nu and narration, not re-nu and narration. Watch those letters. Then we have corporate social responsibility, or CSR. You can prioritize corporate social responsibility in speaking task 6. Canadian companies aggressively market their CSR to attract top talent. The common mistake is simply forgetting to include the word social in the phrase. Lastly, an economic recession or downturn. Use weather and economic downturn for reading part 3 texts, discussing resource-dependent provincial economies that face boom and bust cycles. The trap here is throwing the word recession around casually. A recession is technically 2 quarters of negative growth, whereas a downturn is a safer, much broader term for general use.
Here we hit the dichotomy of our current economy. On one hand, we have inflationary pressure. If you're tackling listening part 6 audio on economics, listen for the collocation exacerbate inflationary pressure, especially in the context of rising grocery and fuel costs across Canada right now. The trap is using inflation as an adjective instead of the proper inflationary. On the other hand, we have stagnant wages. You might grapple with stagnant wages in a writing task 2 living cost survey. This perfectly describes the gap between rising housing costs and unchanging salaries. The absolutely critical trap to remember is that the adjective stagnant is frequently misused as a verb. You cannot say the wages stagnated. It must be wages remain stagnant.
Let's shift gears over to corporate opportunities and hazards. First, a lucrative opportunity. You can present a lucrative opportunity in speaking task 5 persuasive pitches, particularly when discussing booming tech and real estate sectors. Pay close attention to the pronunciation. It's lucrative. Next is occupational hazard. You would mitigate an occupational hazard in a task 1 letter to HR. Canadian labor laws strictly mandate workplace safety, making this term highly relevant. Just don't forget the double C in occupational when writing it down. Then we have work-life integration. You'll want to promote work-life integration in speaking task 6. Notice the subtle shift here. Canadian corporate culture now actively prefers the term integration over balance, which acknowledges modern remote work realities. Make sure you don't hyphenate it incorrectly. Finally, an entrepreneurial endeavor. You can embark on an entrepreneurial endeavor in reading part 4 text about Canada's strong startup ecosystem. The trap? The spelling of entrepreneurial is brutal. Break it down carefully. E-N-T-R-E-P-R-E-N-U-I-A-R, Rekiel.
Let's group these next 4 crucial terms, starting with fiduciary duty. You'll see phrases like breach of fiduciary duty in reading part 3 corporate texts. Real estate agents and financial advisors in Canada are strictly bound by this. The trap is the fixed preposition, which is always duty to. Next, the blue-collar and white-collar workforce. You might discuss a transition to a white-collar workforce in listening part 6, especially regarding Canada's shift from manufacturing to service and tech industries. Remember to include the hyphen when these are used as adjectives. Then there's monopoly. You can dismantle a monopoly in reading part 4. Telecom and airline industries in Canada are often criticized as oligopolies or monopolies. The key trap is saying you have a monopoly on a market, not in a market. Lastly, subsidize. Governments will heavily subsidize initiatives in writing task 2, like subsidizing childcare or green tech. Just keep in mind that subsidize is the verb, while subsidy is the noun. Let's unpack some fantastic vocabulary for speaking task 6. First is career trajectory. You might talk about how you want to alter my career trajectory during workplace conversations, perhaps referring to lateral moves in modern Canadian companies. The trap is pronouncing the J cleanly, say trajectory. Next, merit-based promotion. You would advocate for merit-based promotion in a Task 1 letter requesting a raise. This touches on strict anti-nepotism norms in Canadian business. And don't forget to hyphenate merit-based. Finally, for the gig economy, you'll often rely on the gig economy in writing Task 2 when discussing the massive rise of food delivery and rideshare contractors. Just be careful. Never use the word gig informally in an academic essay unless you pair it directly with the word economy. To wrap up the economic focus, let's look at remote collaboration. You might need to facilitate remote collaboration in a Task 1 email to colleagues. This is absolutely essential for coast-to-coast teams spanning different Canadian time zones. The trap is spelling collaboration with one L. It definitely needs two. Next is optimize productivity. You can implement tools to optimize productivity in Speaking Task 7, often concerning tech-driven workplace efficiency. Remember the preposition, you optimize for productivity. Then we have fiscal policy. You might read about efforts to tighten fiscal policy in Reading Part 4, dealing with federal budgets and taxation. A very common trap is confusing fiscal policy, which is government revenue and taxes, with monetary policy, which deals with central bank interest rates. Lastly, supply chain disruption. A sector might be vulnerable to supply chain disruption in Listening Part 6, like those post-pandemic inventory issues we saw in Canadian retail. The trap is saying disruption to, not disruption of.
Environment and urban planning. Ecological policy and infrastructure.
When it comes to ecological policy, precision is everything on the exam. Let's look at sustainable development. You should prioritize sustainable development in writing Task 2, particularly for municipal planning that integrates green spaces. The trap here is that sustainable is an adjective. Don't say sustained development. Next is your carbon footprint. We all need to reduce our collective carbon footprint in Speaking Task 7 when discussing individual and corporate environmental accountability. Keep in mind that footprint is singular in this context. Then we have ecological degradation. We must aim to halt ecological degradation in Reading Part 4 science texts, which might cover deforestation and mining impacts. The spelling trap, using an E instead of an A in the middle of degradation. Finally, urban sprawl. You might want to combat urban sprawl in Task 2 town surveys, especially regarding the rapid outward expansion of areas like the Greater Toronto Area. Just remember that sprawl is uncountable in this context. Let's rapid fire through some terms you'll constantly see in local Canadian media. First, renewable energy incentives. A government might introduce renewable energy incentives in Listening Part 6, like provincial rebates for solar panels or EVs. The trap is pluralizing incentives when you are referring to one specific program. Next is waste management. You could overhaul waste management in a Task 1 letter to the city regarding strict recycling and composting municipal bylaws. The trap here is using the basic word garbage instead of the much higher scoring term waste. Then we have traffic congestion. You'll want to alleviate traffic congestion in Speaking Task 7, a constant theme given the endless construction seasons in Canadian cities. Congestion is uncountable, so never say traffic congestions. Lastly, a commuter transit system. You might suggest to expand the commuter transit system in writing Task 2, thinking of things like the GO train or SkyTrain expansions. The trap is forgetting the hyphen if it's used as a compound modifier. This next pairing perfectly highlights the active versus passive vocabulary you need for writing Task 2. On the active side, we have greenhouse gas emissions. The collocation is curb greenhouse gas emissions for writing Task 2, frequently concerning Canada's national climate targets. The key trap here is that emissions must be pluralized. On the passive side, we have the depletion of natural resources. You might read how certain practices accelerate the depletion of natural resources in Reading Part 4, which is super relevant to Canada's resource-heavy economy involving oil and lumber. The trap is using depleting as a noun instead of the formal depletion. Always ensure you have the correct verb pairings. Let's keep the rhythm going with 4 highly topical urban issues. First, biodegradable materials. We can transition to biodegradable materials in Speaking Task 7, echoing the federal ban on single-use plastics. The spelling trap is bio-d-gradable. Next, we can revitalize neighborhoods. You might fund projects to revitalize neighborhoods in Task 1 community letters addressing gentrification and urban renewal. For the trap, spelling neighborhoods with or without the U is totally fine, but stay consistent with your chosen regional spelling throughout the entire exam. Then we have pedestrian-friendly zones. Cities will designate pedestrian-friendly zones in writing Task 2, like closing downtown streets to cars during summer festivals. The hyphen in pedestrian-friendly is absolutely mandatory here. Finally, the affordable housing crisis. We urgently need to address the affordable housing crisis in Listening Part 6, as it's arguably the most discussed domestic issue in Canada today. The trap? Do not say cheap housing. Affordable housing is the precise public policy term.
When you're strictly dealing with Listening Part 6 public policy discussions, green space preservation is key. You can advocate for green space preservation when talking about protecting the greenbelt or local parks. The trap is that space must be singular here. Next is environmental stewardship. You can demonstrate environmental stewardship in Reading Part 3, looking at corporate and indigenous models of land care. The main trap is simply spelling stewardship correctly. Finally, imposing carbon taxes. You might debate the efficacy of imposing carbon taxes in Speaking Task 7. This is a highly polarized federal policy in Canada. The grammatical trap is using the preposition on. You are imposing carbon taxes on industries.
Let's finish up with 3 critical environmental terms and their grammatical pitfalls. First is mitigate climate change. You'll write about global efforts to mitigate climate change in Writing Task 2, referencing Canada's international treaty obligations. The trap here is super simple. Do not use the word "the" before climate change. Next, zoning regulations. You might request to amend strict zoning regulations in a Task 1 formal letter, specifically regarding municipal laws that prevent high-density housing. The trap is that zoning acts as an adjective here, modifying the plural noun regulations. Finally, energy-efficient architecture. A government might mandate energy-efficient architecture in Reading Part 4, which is crucial for building codes adapted to harsh Canadian winters. The key trap is ensuring you hyphenate energy-efficient. You now possess the advanced lexicon of an integrated Canadian citizen. The only question left is, how will you deploy it to dominate Task 7?